All right, welcome everyone. Welcome and good evening. Thank you for joining us for another NAMPS webinar. My name is Natasha Gonzalez. I'm a member of the NAMPS board, and I have alongside me here Ali Hayes, our social media coordinator. We are going to be your facilitators for tonight's talk. So as everyone's trickling in, I will just give you guys a bit of a reminder of what tonight's talk is all about. We are all aware that climate change is like a global threat whose impacts can be seen and felt on multiple scales. So tonight, our guest speaker, Kimberly Bell, in her talk titled The Risk of Climate Change for the Home Garden, she's going to discuss what to expect from climate change in Ontario over the next 25 years, its associated risks, its implications to the home garden, as well as gardening tips and safety measures that we can all take to ensure a safe and successful garden. So just a little bit about our speaker before she starts her talk. Kimberly holds a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from York University, a Certificate of Risk Management from McMaster University, and she's currently completing a Master of Science in Rural Planning and Development from the University of Guelph. She additionally has a number of professional designations in project management and Canadian risk management. So Kimberly is extremely passionate about the environment and truly believes in the importance of building strong, healthy, and resilient communities. And we are so lucky to have her here tonight. And at this point, I hand the stage over to Kimberly. Again, thank her for speaking to us tonight, for taking the time to do so.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen, Natasha?
That looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this webinar represents all of my passions. I love to grow food, and I'm deeply interested, as Natasha mentioned, in the risks of climate change, both as an individual and as a planning and risk management professional. So I really wanted to share the risks of climate change with our members today, because being informed helps us to take action. And as you'll see, gardening actually provides benefits. And I'd like to let everyone know that today's talk is going to be broad rather than deep. However, we can go into more depth on topics during the question period. And there are three general parts to this talk. So the first is on climate change predictions from today until the 2050s. And this will give us the bigger picture understanding. It is a bit of a technical section because we're looking at forecasted numbers. However, the rest of the webinar is more conversational. The second part is on what the actual risks are that will be caused by climate change specific to the home garden. And then lastly, we're going to go over how do we mitigate or exploit these risks. So the difference between weather and climate is time. The climate data projections for this presentation are taken from the Impacts of Climate Change group at the Laboratory of Mathematical Parallel Systems at York University. So that's a mouthful, but the acronym for this team is LAMPS. And they analyzed and interpreted climate information for many data sets and also from many model simulations to generate the climate scenarios for Ontario that we're going to look at. Importantly, there is uncertainty whenever we're looking at climate data and projections. So the actual climate that we experience in 25 years could be colder or warmer, and it could be wetter or drier than what we've actually predicted. And it's also important to note that when we talk about the 2050s, it's actually a range of time that starts as early as 2041 and could be as late as 2070. So what we mean by that is if we are projecting a 4-degree increase in a certain area, that 4-degree increase could happen as early as 2041, and it could happen as late as 2070. So this slide shows us the change in projected temperature in 2050 over June, July, and August as the summer months, as compared with the 1981 to 2010 climate average. And if we look at Toronto as an example, we can see that the average of the past was 20 to 22 degrees Celsius over the summer months. The 2050s has projected the average to be 24 to 26 degrees. And it's likely that this extra heat will not be evenly or consistently felt, but rather we will have periodic heat waves as we experience now, though those heat waves are expected to increase in frequency and length. So this slide shows the change in projected precipitation in 2050 over June, July, and August as compared with the 1981 to 2010 climate average. Again, if we look at Toronto as an example, the average up to 2010 was 200 to 250 millimeters of precipitation over the summer. The 2050s projected average for Toronto is actually the same amount. There is no change in the total precipitation. However, over the entire province, we see a slight decrease in the amount of precipitation that is predicted. And we can see this in that there's less blue and dark blue areas. But what this diagram doesn't convey is that although the rainfall amounts look similar, the way that we receive precipitation is likely to change. So in other words, we expect that there will be longer periods without rain, possibly creating drought-like conditions, and then there will be more extreme rainfall events. So not always, but this is a pattern that's going to increase over time. So this slide shows the change in projected temperature in 2050 over December, January, and February, as compared with the 1981 to 2010 climate average. Again, if we look at Toronto, the average up until 2010 was -6 to -3 degrees Celsius. The 2050s projected average is 0 to +3 degrees Celsius. And it's likely that this heat will not be evenly or consistently felt. So this slide is showing us the change in projected precipitation in 2050 over December, January, and February as compared with the 1981 to 2010 climate average. And again, if we look at Toronto as our example, the average up until 2010 was 150 to 200 millimeters of precipitation over the winter. The 2050s projection for Toronto is 200 to 250 millimeters, which is a 20% increase in overall precipitation. Across the province, we see an overall increase in precipitation in most areas. So this extra winter precipitation is actually concerning because it means that the risk of flooding will increase in the future. And I will explain more about this in the coming slides. So just to recap, this summer will be warmer and drier in general. The winter will be warmer and wetter in general. And changes in temperature and precipitation will not be evenly felt across the season or across the province. So what are the actual risks? Extreme weather is definitely one of our major risks. And as someone who grew up in Toronto, I used to experience large temperature fluctuations all the time. So when I first heard about an increase of 4 degrees over the summer, that didn't seem like a problem to me. And that's because I was thinking of temperature from the perspective of day-to-day weather. But when it comes to temperature, when it comes to climate change, we need to think about degrees of increase as being heat energy on top of our regular climate. So it's not just a regular day plus 4 degrees, it's 4 degrees of extra energy within our climate system. So this extra energized climate means that we will have more intense rainfall, more intense drought, more intense wind, longer heat waves, and greater snowfall when we do have snow. It also means that we will experience greater shifts in temperature, and that this can actually create the risk for flood conditions. So we've seen this happen a number of times in Ontario, and Muskoka is an excellent example of this. And essentially what happens is we have a warm weather front will come in, and the ground will still be frozen and there will be snowpack. So the warm weather will melt the snowpack and it will bring moisture. So it will create rain. And if we think of the ground as a sponge, we need that sponge to be able to absorb the water in order to prevent flooding. But if that sponge is frozen, or if that sponge is already super saturated from snowmelt, then it cannot accept and absorb the extra moisture that's coming in with the warm weather system. And so all of that rain falls, and then the rivers will overflow their banks and wetlands will also overflow. So invasive species is another major risk that we have to be mindful of, and climate change offers opportunities for invasive species to take hold in Ontario. So we've already seen this with the migration of ticks that are moving throughout the province, and we've also seen this with the migration of the mountain pine beetle in BC and Alberta, and there are many, many more examples of invasive species, and there will continue to be more examples. So this is just such a cute little bee. I just love bees. So the loss of pollinators, sadly, is another risk that we have to be mindful of. And according to the US Department of Agriculture, pollinators are impacted by climate change in a number of ways. So warmer temperatures can encourage plants to bloom sooner, but not all pollinators can adapt to an early blooming season. Pollinators are also vulnerable to periods of drought because plants will make less nectar because they're preserving their own water, and therefore there's less food available for pollinators. And then this less food available means that it could impact their health and it can impact their reproductive cycles. In addition, extreme rainfall can also present a challenge for pollinators as it reduces the number of hours that they can fly and gather resources from flowers. So health risks are one of the most important risks that a group of risks that we need to pay attention to when it comes to climate change. Health risks are already largely present, but they will continue to expand. So according to the Ontario Ministry of Health, ticks present a significant health threat to humans. Some ticks, such as the black-legged tick, can spread Lyme disease, as well as several other diseases, such as Powassan virus. Ticks are being carried across the province by birds and deer and other animals. Although it's not probable, it is possible to find ticks that are infected with disease almost anywhere in Ontario. And let's not forget about mosquitoes, which also carry disease. According to the Government of Canada, endemic mosquito-borne diseases in humans have increased by approximately 10% over the last 20 years, which is largely attributed to climate change. And another obvious health risk that we have to keep in mind with climate change is exposure to heat. So I personally learned this lesson the hard way. My first season as a market gardener, there was a heat wave. And of course, my first thought was, my garden, it needs to be watered. So I went to my garden and I had intended to come indoors at 10 a.m. And before I knew it, I had a headache, I was dizzy, and it was already noon and I had been outside for several hours. So it's really easy to lose track of time. And so we need to be very mindful when there is a heat warning to have shorter periods outdoors. And another recommendation that I now follow is that I don't go outside between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So this avoids the worst UV rays, and it also keeps me out of my garden when it's really hot outside. And in fact, when there is a heat warning, sometimes I won't even go outside until 6 or 7 p.m. So furthermore, on health risks, according to the City of Mississauga, some impacts of climate change that adversely affect wildlife include increased disease, increased invasive species, diminished food sources, habitat loss, strained reproduction cycles. And it's important to note that habitat loss and diminished food sources will potentially bring wildlife closer to each other. And as animals get closer to each other, it's easier for them to spread disease to each other. In addition, as they are looking for resources, they will be drawn closer to our homes and gardens in search of food and shelter. And wildlife carry more than just rabies. They also carry Lyme disease that they also get from ticks. But animals such as raccoons can carry things like parasitic roundworms, which can infect humans and pets. And we don't need to come in contact with the raccoon directly. We just need to come in contact with their scat, which could have been on our garden, or our pet could come in contact with it. So we want to basically keep animals out of our backyards and not draw attention to our backyards. Another important thing to keep in mind are forest fires. Last summer's forest fires are probably still fresh in our minds. It was a terrible forest fire season. We smoked out New York State. And unfortunately, forest fires are predicted to become more widespread. And according to the Ontario Ministry of Health, forest fire smoke is made up of a mixture of gases and very small particles that are produced when wood and other organic matter burn. And these small particles are very harmful to our health. So just as we need to avoid being outside during heat warnings, we actually need to also pay attention to air quality warnings, and we should be aware of the air quality outside and follow Ministry of Health recommendations. So I love this picture. I took this picture at Costco because I was just astounded at the cost of 8 cans of organic tomatoes. The future might be significantly more expensive. So there is a risk that inflation will continue, especially for food. Climate change is predicted to decrease some farmed crop yields through drought, extreme weather, plant disease, and invasive species. So examples of crops that come to mind are coffee, chocolate, and avocados, but there are many, many more examples. So climate change is also expected to have an impact on our infrastructure, such as our hydro grid. So it's possible that the cost of water and hydro may be higher in the future. And the cost of home insurance is also expected to significantly increase, as climate change will be most likely increasing the risk of flooding, and therefore insurance companies will be paying out massive claims, and then they will in turn be raising our policies. And the claims due to flooding have already started, and insurance companies are already paying out unprecedented claims in regard to flooding. So extended growing season, this is the risk we've all been hoping for as gardeners. And an extended growing season is actually an example of a positive risk or the upside of risk, and it's also known as an opportunity. So personally, I'm already thinking about how many more things I can grow, because of course that's what gardeners do. So this data is also taken from the Ontario Climate Data Portal as calculated and published by the LAMPS team at York University. And this slide shows how many more frost-free days we are expecting to have across the province by the 2050s. Toronto, as our example, is expected to have an extra 16 to 20 frost-free days. And as you'll notice, when we look at the province as a whole, we see that some areas, especially the more northern areas, will receive up to 45 additional frost-free days. And this is because warming is not consistent across the province, and more northern areas are warming faster. So the question is, how do we prevent, mitigate, and exploit these risks? So the most important thing that you can do to mitigate the risks of climate change for your garden is to keep your soil covered at all times and at all seasons. Keeping the soil covered with natural materials helps to keep the soil cool. It protects the top layer of soil from solar radiation. It helps to keep moisture in the soil. It suppresses weed seeds, and it provides a barrier between the soil and the plant leaves, which prevents soil pathogens such as powdery mildew from splashing onto the leaves during heavy rains. And as the natural materials break down, they feed the soil and they increase soil carbon. So there are many excellent options to choose from, and each of them has their own pros and cons. So the first example that we have here are wood chips. I love wood chips. They're durable, but they can be expensive, and you want to make sure that you purchase untreated wood chips for your garden. Importantly, wood chips help to prevent the movement of ticks. So if we look at this first example here, we can see that there's a beautiful wide border around the actual crops that they're growing. This is excellent because it will stop the movement of ticks, or it will help prevent the movement of ticks. So ticks are less likely to actually make their way onto your crops, which is where you would be in close, close distance to those ticks. The other thing that this nice wide border does is it helps to suppress grass as well. So, and you're suppressing weeds that are all around the area of your garden. So cover crops are our second example. They're in the center. And they're great. They can be less expensive than wood chips. However, when you purchase cover crops, you have to make that purchase carefully. So examples of cover crops are things like legumes such as hairy vetch, or grains such as oats, barley, and rye. But it's important, as I mentioned, to research your cover crop before purchasing it, because a cover crop has an effect on your soil, and depending on the cover crop that you purchase, it will have its own impact. So some cover crops add nitrogen. Some of them could help uncompact the soil. Some of them could help combat plant parasitic nematodes. And some of them, most of them actually, will add carbon. So I was actually taught by a farmer who both used cover crops on his fields, and he sold cover crop seed, to think of cover crop as medicine. So if you have a specific problem with your soil, you would then find the cover crop that treated that problem. And our last example here for mulch is leaves. So leaves are excellent because they add many nutrients back into the soil, and they're a free resource. And in fact, my neighbors actually bag them up, and I just have to go to the curb and help myself. Um, so that's great. They also provide shelter for native pollinators to hibernate over the winter, but they would also provide shelter for ticks. So it's really important that if you are handling leaves, that you wear protective clothing, because ticks could always be hiding in those leaves. And then also, when we're working with leaves and wood chips, or even straw as a mulch, we want to aim for 4 to 6 inches of mulch, which sounds like a lot, but that provides a really great barrier, and it's at this thickness that you're getting the biggest benefits. You're getting all of those benefits. So raised garden beds are the second most effective tool to combat extreme weather that we are likely to experience with climate change. And as heavy precipitation events become more frequent and intense, it will be easy for our gardens to drown and for the soil to be washed away. So raised garden beds, they elevate our plants, and they ensure that the soil doesn't become saturated with water. And they can also protect the soil from being washed away when there is a barrier or a wood frame. So raised garden beds allow the soil to warm faster in the spring than just a garden that is flush with the ground. And they're also easier to cover with fabric and hoop houses. So they make it much easier for us to extend the growing season than simply just growing, like I said, in the ground. It's important that when you build these gardens, that you're not digging the soil underneath the bed. All you want to do when you're building a raised garden bed is take a frame and place it directly on the ground. So even if it's in the middle of your lawn that you want to place a garden, you are just taking that frame and you are just placing it directly on the lawn. You are not digging, and then you are just filling it in with the material that you need. Um, and then you are not laying a layer of cardboard there as well. So a final note is that if you do not have a frame around your garden, it's still tremendously beneficial for you to mound up your soil and build a raised bed. So as a market gardener, the beds that I was growing on were 100 feet long. So there was no way that I could afford to put like wooden frames around those beds. But just having the mounded soil provided many benefits, such as warming the soil and preventing them from drowning during heavy rainfall. So I touched on this on the previous slide, but when we're building a raised bed, we do not want to disturb the soil underneath the bed. And so again, what you want to do when you're building a raised bed is you just want to place a garden frame on top of the ground, and you want to fill it with your organic materials, so your soil and your compost. And there's no need to place cardboard over the grass because the 10 to 12 inches of soil that you're placing in that garden bed is definitely enough to kill that grass, and the grass and its roots will break down and then will just add nutrients into the overall soil. So once you have established your raised bed, also, you do not want to till or fluff up the soil in the bed. And the reason is because in the winter, the soil freezes. So it expands when it freezes, and then it thaws, and then it freezes and it thaws. And as this happens, clumps are formed. And this happens also as the soil is moved through other processes like worms moving through it or plant roots. All of this movement, again, it helps to form clumps. So the official term for these clumps is actually called soil aggregates. And unlike lumps in porridge or mashed potatoes, soil aggregates are helpful for your garden. They allow both air and water to pass through the soil, and they allow that water to be held in place. So they are what creates the sponge effect of the ground. And when you till, you are removing those spaces that allow water to penetrate deeply into your soil. And so what you end up with is pooling around the surface of your garden, and the water's not getting down, or it's taking longer to get down into the soil where your plant roots are. So back to cardboard, when you lay cardboard as a foundation for your raised bed, you're hindering rather than improving your garden, because you're actually blocking your plant's roots from getting down into that soil structure. And some people might think that using cardboard is a way to prevent plants like Canadian thistle or burdock, and Canadian thistle is not Canadian. Um, but actually, I found that Canadian thistle and burdock can burst right through cardboard. So the best way to deal with weeds like that is just to keep digging them up with a shovel and weakening those tap roots over time. So the greatest part of climate change for the garden is definitely extending the growing season. And this slide is just here to help us understand how we should think about extra frost-free days in the season. So the way we should think about it, of taking advantage of those frost-free days, is by generally keeping the growing, like the safe frost-free days, which is like the green area here. So the dates between the generally accepted last frost date and the first frost date, we want to kind of keep those the same. We'll keep those as our safe growing time. But it's the area on the edges that we really want to pay attention to here, because that's where most of the opportunity is. So generally in the Toronto area, the May 2-4 weekend is considered the start of the frost-free growing season. But in a really warm year like this year, I'm going to attempt to plant my tomatoes 2 weeks early, but I'm also going to be prepared to protect those plants in case of a sudden frost. And so by doing that, I'm extending my growing season by a couple of weeks, but I'm using techniques such as hoop houses and frost cloth in order to do that. So the other way that we might want to think about an extended potentially warmer growing season is by thinking about our cool crops. So right now, if you're growing cool crops such as peas or early potatoes, you might be planting them in mid-April. Yeah, but in the future, we might be able to get our cool crops in the ground in the beginning of March. So if you can imagine that, then we might actually be able to get a full harvest of cool crops in prior to planting our warm crops. And I'll show you what that might look like. Extending the growing season. So if we have a limited amount of space, and most of us have a limited amount of space, here we've got these 3 garden beds. And what we're doing is we're extending the growing season through the use of hoop houses and plastic or gardening fabric to help trap the heat. And we've got an early potatoes, garlic that we planted the fall prior, and then carrots. And we might actually be able to get these planted as early as, say, March, and then harvest them all before we then take the same space and then plant our warm crops. And then maybe we'll harvest our warm crops a little bit early by, say, the end of September in order to get 3 more crops planted in the same space. And then we might be able to get a harvest of salad greens out of that same garden. Whereas before, we might have only gotten our summer crops planted. Now we're extending both ends of the growing season. It's important to note here as well that when we're choosing crops and we're extending the growing season, that we're choosing crops that don't require pollinators. So, my potatoes, my garlic, and my carrots don't require pollinators, whereas my summer crops do. And this is when all of the pollinators will be active. And again, my salad greens, my spinach, my radishes, they also do not require pollinators. So it's also important to note that with climate change, best practice will still be the best practice. And so some of the critical best practices that we should be using in our garden are things like rotating our crops. So, in the first year, or in the first part of the season, if I'm growing tomatoes in this bed, when I am choosing a different crop for the same bed, I'm not choosing another nightshade. So instead of planting maybe peppers, potatoes, or eggplant here, I'm going to choose a completely different family, like a legume or a cucurbit. And that helps to draw different nutrients from the soil and then add certain nutrients back into the soil. And it also helps to deter plant diseases and plant pests that focus on one type of family. So as we mentioned, the future will be more expensive. And so choosing our crops strategically is really important. Many years ago, I tried an experiment. So I'm always experimenting with my garden. And the one experiment I did, I wanted to see if I could be self-sufficient in just one thing. And so I grew 300 onions. And I had onion braids and I had frozen onions. I did lots of things with onions. But then when I reflected, I realized that my onions didn't really taste any better than the onions at the store. However, and the onions at the store were a good price, but my heirloom tomatoes are better than any tomato that I could buy at the store. And the organic heirloom tomatoes at the store were very expensive. And so I realized that what we need to do is be very strategic with what we grow and our limited growing space. So now when I'm choosing crops, I focus on what do we love? What tastes so much better in my garden than anything I could buy at the store? And what is really expensive? And those are the things that I prioritize. And then I iterate. So for example, bell peppers, we love bell peppers. They're expensive, but they do not grow well in my garden. And so I have taken them out because they're just not a good use of space. They're not going to be productive enough. And so that's how I think about strategically what I'm going to grow in my garden with my very limited space. The other thing that I do is I have what are called convenience plants. So celery, for example, my celery doesn't even taste as good as the celery at the store, and the celery at the store is not expensive. But if I have one celery plant, then I can always just go into my backyard, grab a stalk of celery, grab some chives, and then if I've got some eggs or if I've got a can of tuna, I can make a meal. So just having these couple of convenience plants keeps me out of the grocery store. So I find that it's a better use. It helps me to use my time better and possibly delays my trips to the grocery store. So that's another strategy that I find very effective. So another important risk treatment is to plant a pollinator garden. So you want to invite pollinators into your property. And this is one of my pollinator gardens. And on the left, we see a little gray tree frog just chilling on a milkweed leaf. So I grow many native plants across my property, but this one bed is wild. It's the wild part of my yard. And it requires, because they're all native plants, they require very little water, very little fertilizing, and I just let them do their thing. And by not cleaning up the bed and by just by not mulching it, by just letting it do its thing, I'm providing opportunities for pollinators to also hibernate there. And ideally, when you're thinking about inviting pollinators into your garden, you want to think about including plants that bloom at different times so that there's always a food source available to draw in the pollinators. So we want to think about composting differently. When I see a composter, as a gardener, I get excited. However, what we're learning is that the potential risks of climate change really will create intensification of wildlife around our homes. And so we don't want to invite wildlife into our gardens. And one of the ways that we can do that is actually by composting differently. So the two composters there, the one on the left and the one in the middle, they allow small mammals such as mice and rats to actually live in them, and they provide food and they provide shelter and they actually provide warmth because of the decomposition. So if you want to eliminate these kinds of opportunities for small mammals, one way of composting is with a tumbler composter, because they're off the ground and they don't have the large air spaces where small mammals can access them. And so, of course, we want to wear protective clothing and stay hydrated. Sun hats, gloves, boots, long sleeve shirts, even in the summer, will help to protect us against sun exposure and insects. Long pants can be hot in the summer, but they're great in the spring and the fall, and you want to tuck your pants into your socks. And they will also help to prevent ticks from crawling up your legs, and mosquito bites around your ankles. And again, as mentioned, we want to be very mindful of heat warnings, and we want to avoid the sun during 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., especially when the UV index is high, and we want to make sure that we take breaks when we're gardening. So the CDC recommends that you learn where ticks will be in your backyard, and that you learn to avoid ticks, and that you check yourself, your children, and your pets when you come indoors. And they recommend putting your clothing when you come inside in the dryer on hot for 10 minutes. So if you just wash and dry your clothes on cool, that's not enough to kill ticks. You actually have to put them in the dryer on high heat for 10 minutes to kill ticks. They also recommend that you shower within 20 minutes of coming indoors. So there is rising concern around ticks, especially as they increase in numbers and spread throughout Ontario. So now I'd like to play a short 2-minute video by the Government of Canada that does a great job at illustrating the highest risk areas for ticks. And it makes excellent recommendations on how we can reduce ticks around our home, as well as diligent action that you can take to greatly reduce your risk of being infected by a tick bite.
The best way to protect you and your family from tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease is to prevent tick bites. Contrary to popular belief, ticks can be found outside of rural areas, in cities, suburbs, playgrounds, and even backyards. Areas with trees, shrubs, tall grass, and piles of leaves are ideal hiding places for them. Remember that ticks are active anytime the temperature is above freezing. That means ticks can be found around your home and places you visit all year round. Here are some tips to help you reduce ticks around your home. Mow the lawn regularly. Ticks don't like short grass. Remove leaf litter and weeds at the edge of the lawn, around stone walls and wood piles to help make it less inviting for ticks. Create a 1 meter or wider wood chip, mulch, or gravel border between your lawn and shrubs, woods, or stone edges. This helps reduce ticks on your lawn. Put up barriers around your home and seal stone walls and other openings to help prevent animals like deer, mice, and other rodents from bringing ticks into your yard. Place patios, decks, and children's play sets away from yard edges and trees, and if possible, on a wood chip or mulch foundation. Talk to your veterinarian about tick prevention products for your pets, as they can also carry ticks onto your property and indoors. After being outdoors, inspect your clothing, your gear, and your pets for ticks before going inside. Also, do a full body tick check on yourself, and don't forget to check your family. Learn how to protect yourself against tick bites and tick-borne illnesses on canada.ca/Lyme disease. A message.
So this slide here talks about conserving water, but it also encompasses many of the risk treatments that we've already discussed. So in terms of conserving water, again, water may be more expensive in the future. And so we do want to reduce how much water we use. We can take advantage of free water with the use of water barrels, and we can also install drip lines. And drip lines are actually a cost-effective way of watering our gardens. And some key tips when we're installing drip lines. One of them is that you want to install the drip lines directly on top of the soil, and then you would put your 4 to 6 inches of mulch on top of the drip lines. So that would ensure that the water gets right into the roots of the plants and that the mulch is then helping to lock in the moisture. And the other really important thing when you're installing drip lines is that you need to have a pressure gauge. So if you don't use a pressure gauge, or at least in my experience, I turned on my drip lines and my drip lines looked like sprinklers. And so you want to have that pressure gauge because the idea with the drip line is that it's a slow drip that will allow the plants to actually absorb the water at the speed that the drip line is dripping. The other great thing that you can do with a drip line is you can add a timer. So that will ensure that you don't just walk away and forget that the drip lines are on and then overwater your plants. And you can also take advantage of the timer so that if it's too hot or the air quality is poor, that your plants could still get watered and you're not at risk of exposure to the outdoors. The other things that we should really take note of here in this diagram is that we've got a fence around the property. So we can see here that there is a fence all the way around the property, which would help stop deer and coyotes and hopefully rabbits and skunks. And we have got the use of hoop houses, and we can use either plastic or landscaping fabric or frost fabric to help extend the season depending on the conditions. We've got a nice wide border of wood chips all around our garden area, and we're using trellises to help expand how much food that we can actually grow within this limited space. And we've also got mulch on top of the soil. The lawn is nicely trimmed, so it's nice and short and it's trimmed, and there's no big piles of wood chips or there's no big piles of leaves and things like that that small mammals could use for shelter. There's a pollinator garden to help attract pollinators into the space. We've got tumbler composters instead of a big pile or an open compost. And we have, there is a tree, and hopefully you can see the gray smudge here, this gray smudge around the tree. That is the canopy of the tree in the diagram. And essentially on the patio, if we were to sit on the patio, we wouldn't put furniture under the canopy of the tree because birds could be up in the canopy and they could be defecating, or we could have ticks drop on us. Essentially, we would want to put the patio furniture over on this side, and we would want shade from an umbrella. So those are all of the components here that capture a lot of what we've learned today. And finally, we want to think about invasive species management for our gardens. So staying informed on invasive species is step one in terms of combating invasive species. Jumping worms are a perfect example of a challenging invasive species for our gardens. There is currently no regulated method of controlling jumping worms. However, research is being done. And what's really interesting about jumping worms and many other invasive species is that they tend to inhabit the South or mid-United States prior to coming to the Great Lakes region and then moving north through Ontario. So by staying informed, we can learn how these other states are managing them, and we can learn from their experiences in helping to control the invasive species. So I would like to thank everyone for listening to my presentation today, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for a great and informative presentation. You've given a lot of excellent material, and obviously there's a strong focus on protection and just being aware of the risk when we go outside to enjoy a garden. And it's always a balance to find that happy median. So everyone has the option to take what they need from the information. I know there was a lot of concern um, in recent years in regards to the prevalence of ticks and their movement into Ontario. Then, and for some, it's preventing people from enjoying their outside, enjoying the outdoors and getting back to nature. So at least having a wide span of information is allowing them to feel maybe less scared and engage more with nature and, choose the options that's best for your personal safety and in balance with the environment and your wildlife interaction. I've lost my words, but yeah. So thank you. I'm going to open the room to questions. There was a lot of useful commentary coming in throughout your talk, and so I'm really impressed with the community conversation and support that everyone is having for with each other. And let me see if I can read through any of the immediate questions. Regarding native plants, are native species indigenous to the region climate ready in the rapid changing climate time? That question's coming from George.
So so what I'm hearing in that question is, I guess is the question, are native plants going to continue to thrive in a changing climate? Does that sound like the rewording of that question?
Are native species indigenous to the region climate ready in the
Climate ready?
rapid changing climate?
Right. Okay. So I think I did understand that question. That is an excellent question, actually, because this is something that keeps me up at night, actually. When we think about trees, and I actually did have the opportunity to ask a biologist about this question. When we think about oak trees, for example, we think, okay, oak trees can grow quite south and they can grow quite north. And so if I think about an oak tree that's been growing all its life in southern Ontario, I think, okay, this oak tree is going to be fine with climate change because I know that this species is growing as far south as, say, Georgia. So the climate, it can handle it. But actually, what they're finding is that this oak tree that has been growing in Ontario all its life is actually used to the Ontario climate. So even though the species itself can grow much farther south and can handle more heat, we're finding that the individual tree itself may have trouble with a changing climate. So what we're finding is that the actual individual trees or plants actually may struggle even if the species range is broader and even if the species range is able to handle the temperatures with climate change. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as the future goes forward, but we expect that will have some impact on our native plants.
Thank you, Kim. I have another question from Ruth. Can raised beds be placed on a slight slope or do they have to be on flat ground?
Oh, I love this question. Actually, no, they can definitely be placed on a slope. In fact, when we think about sustainable farming methods, when we think about farming on a hill, Farmers in the past would often farm like down the hill, and what they would find is that that would increase soil erosion. And so one of the ways that they have found is a more sustainable way to farm is to farm across the hill so that the soil is it's not lost as easily as it would be lost if you were farming down the hill. And I think raised beds could be the same way. You would want to position it. You would want to think about how is the soil going to shift in the raised bed. And if you think it might shift, you might want to put, if you're building a wood frame, you might want to build the end that's the lower part on the slope. You might want to build that taller and just expect that some of that soil might migrate to the lower part of that slope. But as long as you're anticipating that and you're prepared for that, you could also take advantage of that. So you would plant maybe the plants that require the deepest root space in the deeper part of that raised bed. And then plants with shallower root systems could go on the shallower end of that bed. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Kimberly. Going over to a live question from the audience. John Foster, you have your hand raised. Would you like to speak? Ask your question.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Kimberly's comment about plants. What we're finding a lot with climate change is there's a disconnect between insects and birds and the plants that they feed on. What's going to happen with climate change, you're going to see that plants that are adapted to this particular area may in fact be starting to move northward. And we're going to see the input of plants from the south taking over from the plants that are more not as easily adapted to the climate. Also, we may find that even some of the plants that are adapted to this particular area may in fact be probably best adapted to climate change itself, and they may be adaptable to the climate change, and it might be better if we use some of the local genetic material from plants in populations that have been living here for several thousand years. And we might even be good to listen to some of our indigenous brothers and sisters to find out maybe they know something that we don't about the particular plants and what might be needed here in any climate change scenario.
Thank you, John. Another question from the audience or comment potentially. Brendan Samuels, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really enjoyable and I learned a bunch. I have a quick question and a comment. I may have missed it, but when you were presenting your data from the research group at York University, do you know if those projections are based on a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario or a medium to low? The reason I ask is in Ontario, we actually have a risk assessment that was published by the province, and they base their assessment on RCP 8.5, which is a high emissions scenario or like unmitigated global warming, essentially.
Yeah, Brandon, that is an excellent question. I'm glad that you brought that up. Actually, I had a whole slide on that, but I had to cut some of my content. So you are correct. All of the data that I presented today, including the frost-free predictions, were all based on RCP 8.5. And the reason that RCP 8.5 is was the prediction of choice is because 25 years isn't very far in the future. And so it's also the most likely based on the most current data that we have. So that's why we used 8.5. But thank you so much for bringing that up. And also, I just wanted to thank John as well for his comments, because he's exactly right. Species, what we're seeing now with climate change is that the range of species is expanding and moving. So thank you.
So this may be open to discussion. Jumping worms, we have a comment from Gail that segues into a question. Jumping worms can spread in dead leaves. Should we stop using bagged leaves from our neighbors' yards?
That is a great question. I would say So risk management is all about context. It is so very context specific. So in my particular situation, I know that there are no jumping worms in my garden, or my neighbor's garden, and my neighbor actually bags up leaves, and they will just let me know. They'll be like, Kim, I put 3 bags of leaves, against the fence for you. And so I know that I'm safe to use those leaves, but I would say if you're in an area where you have jumping worms, then I would not use your neighbor's leaves. If you don't have a relationship with your neighbor where you can even ask them, hey, do you have jumping worms? Do you mind if I go into your backyard and check for jumping worms? Then I would say you might be better off not using their leaves. But you can, if you do have trees, you can just rake up your own leaves and use them. Or you could just use mulch that has been heat treated and that is safe.
Thank you. A question from Allison in the chat from earlier. Can you please explain again about the PSI gauge on the water barrel drip lines? Water barrel drip lines?
Yeah, sure. So it's not actually for the water barrels. Water barrels don't require a pressure gauge necessarily unless you can somehow hook them up into your drip lines. But when you have a drip line, if you were to just hook them up to a hose without a pressure gauge, what would happen is it would look like a sprinkler. There would be so much pressure going through the drip line that you'd have streams of water. So what a pressure gauge does is it reduces the amount of pressure that gets through, so that what you end up with in your drip line is just like a constant slow drip of water that will then water your plants essentially at the speed that the plant is able to absorb the water. And that is how we minimize water use. And pressure gauges can be bought almost anywhere. So Home Depot, for example.
Okay, thank you. Just going through the chat. We have some good commentary, some positive feedback about the presentation, some added resources for those who are concerned about ticks. And there is some commentary in regards to finding that balance between protecting yourself and creating wildlife barriers to your backyard. Do you have a how to approach it from a holistic, perspective with risk in mind? So how do you find the balance, I guess, between letting things in and keeping things out?
So I would say some of the most important things that we can do is not make it attractive, like not give wildlife reasons to be in our backyard wherever possible. And I know that there was a problem with coyotes in Oakville recently, and coyotes are a really beneficial animal, and they provide ecosystem services just like every other native species does. However, there was problems with coyotes in Oakville, and they actually had to remove the coyotes. And what caused that problem was that someone had an open composter. And so the coyotes were drawn in to the compost. So I think if you're really concerned about wildlife and keeping wildlife out of your backyard, keeping sources of food, almost like when we go camping, I would say just to remove the food source, and also maybe shelter opportunities. Those would be the key ways of keeping them out, because yeah, the risk that wildlife are going to be in our gardens is going to increase, and the risk that wildlife is carrying disease could also potentially increase. So not feeding them is a great way to keep them out.
And then we just have some funny stories about moose strolling through people's backyards. So that's good wildlife.
Yeah.
um,
Oh, I do see
uh,
a hand up as well on the.
uh, Bill Dowie from, yes,
Yeah,
you have
thank
the
you.
stage now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Kim dominated the stage. It was fantastic. You've given me a lot of food for thought, pun intended. I'm doing a thesis on urban ecology and backyard biodiversity. So um I have to recognize these tensions, right? We can't all be ultra pro, Doug Tallamy apostolates and not realize that there are these other problems. So I'm just wondering, like 50 years ago, um, I think you wouldn't have been saying these types of things about the kinds of risk and the way we should compost. Is that because of the urban um, interface is just encroached too much into the rural spaces, and now we're basically taking over the territory of coyotes and small cats and other meso predators.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So the reason that those recommendations were presented is because with climate change, we are expected to have all of the resources that wildlife currently have. And as you mentioned, sprawl has really reduced um, the resources that are available to wildlife. So we have all of this sprawl, we haven't encroached on their territory, but climate change is also going to dramatically reduce their food and shelter opportunities. So wildlife are predicted to come together wherever there is still forest standing or wherever there is still a functioning wetland. They're expected to come together in closer proximity to each other, and that will actually help them to spread disease to each other more rapidly. And so when we have essentially potentially more diseased wildlife, they're also going to potentially come closer into our homes and our gardens. And when they do that, they're going to also carry those diseases. So it's really that with climate change, all of the wildlife will be under more pressure as there are more invasive species, as the native species that they typically feed on right now will be diminished, as there's more drought. All of that wildlife will be under more pressure, and then that pressure will then often bring them into close proximity with humans. That's the theory.
Thank you. So we have a statement and maybe a call for help from one of our audience members, Kathleen. She's feeling hopeless with creeping bellflower and other invasives, and grass can't grow up through the raised bed, but she's just worried that the bellflower might. Any thoughts about such invasives, like those with such aggressive tendencies, and maybe some words as to how not to lose hope?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I know that I haven't dealt with that specific plant before, but when it comes to it, I think it also depends on what it is that you want to grow. So if you're just growing plants that have like shallow root systems, you could try some cardboard possibly if you think that the roots are, if it's like a taproot situation and they're deep in the ground. But I would follow best practice. So for me personally, I had a really big problem with Canadian thistle and burdock at both of the farms that I worked at. And so I did a lot of research on those species specifically. And I found that research showed, this is very interesting actually, that when you dig up those species just before they flower, that their tap roots have used up the most energy. And so when you dig them up at that point, you are doing the most damage to the taproot. So I find that sometimes dealing with an invasive species, it's very species specific. and it's important to find the best practice for that species. And so for the two plants that were my biggest nemesis when I was farming, I would just dig them up over and over again and try to, weaken those taproots. So I would say, yeah, it really depends on the species.
Thank you. Any thoughts about green cones instead of composting? Question from Lisa.
Sure. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Any thoughts about green cones, if you're familiar with that, instead of composting?
Green cones. I'm not sure what that is. Are those the like the feeder sticks? I'm not sure what a green cone is actually.
Any further elaboration, Lisa, if you're still in attendance? Otherwise, we might need to get back to you on that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
We can follow up with you on that.
Comment, Natasha? John Foster?
Thanks, John. Go right ahead.
Green cones are an upside down compost. It works in reverse in some ways to standard composting. So you put the compost inside the cone and then turn it upside down. And it's supposed to send the nutrients into the soil.
Okay, but is it still open? Is it still an
Yes,
open
it
system?
does have openings in it.
Okay, so then it would still provide opportunities for small mammals to access. Okay.
Well, the openings are very small, so
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
Speaking as a member of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, a way that you can get rid of creeping bellflower, if you have a large population, you work inward. You get the small population first by digging them up or tarping them. Tarping is an excellent way of getting rid of a particular invasive. To get rid of creeping bellflower, which has a shallow root system, you can actually pull it up, sort of like you do with garlic mustard, and dispose of the plants just on where you're happening to pull them up. If you are leaving them in the area, it's best to take the plant material, put it inside a very dark garbage bag so that and leave it for 2 weeks. That will kill the plant material and prevent it from resprouting. The sun shines on the black bags and kills the material inside the bags. So that's one way of getting rid of creeping bellflower if you're having that problem in your backyard.
Yeah,
Thanks,
that's
John.
excellent. That's excellent advice, John. Thank you.
Yeah.
And John's a botanist, everybody. So he's also on our board. So we're delighted to have him here answering questions.
Thank you so much. We have another question from the audience from Maggie. Your hand is raised. You have the floor.
Oh, and you're on mute.
Oh, there you go. Now you have the floor.
To just add to the green cone, I have one. You dig a hole in the ground and you put a basket in, and then you put the green cone on top and secure it to the basket, and then fill in the earth all around it. So rodents can't get in. You put the compost in the top and close the lid, and it's double walled, so it gets very hot. And it composts down, and the worms and the bacteria take the nutrients into the soil. I use one all spring, summer, and fall, and it's amazing how much you can put into the green cone, and it rots down and gets dispersed.
Oh, lovely.
So if it's actually in the ground, it does sound like there might be like a burrowing opportunity there, but it does sound like it's definitely less of an opportunity for mammals to access it than an open, like typical composter. So it sounds like less of a risk.
It's a basket, and the basket is joined to the top, so there's no gap.
No, but it's on the soil though.
It's in the soil.
It's in the soil.
Buried deep down. It's buried into the soil. None of the basket shows above ground, and the soil is heaped up right against the green cone.
Thank you so much, Maggie. For anyone who needs like further information on it or is really curious about it, Lisa and Sharon have been kind enough to add some links in our chat with more information about it. So I encourage you to take a quick look or copy over those links if you want to get some more information. We do have a question from Lindsay. What are your thoughts on planting near natives from just south of us now versus in 5 years or 10 years, etc., as temperatures warm and conditions change? So maybe not quite acclimated to our area, but just on the boundary line,
On the
bringing those
cusp.
in. Yeah.
I love that question because I often think about that. I often wonder, at what point will olive trees and fig trees grow in southern Ontario? I think that there are actually a lot of native plants that we could just plant instead. So what I would recommend is, because we want to try to preserve biodiversity, that if you want to plant something, there's lots, especially if you're in southern Ontario, there are lots of Carolinian species that are where we're just the very northern part of their typical range or their historic range, I would say, but we're still part of the range. I would say that those are great species that you might want to choose, because the range of species is going to go north. So let's say we take something like Carolina spicebush. Um, that's a native plant to southern Ontario, but again, we're just at the very northern cusp of its range. Planting plants like that, I think, would be most beneficial, because again, we're still in the range, so you're not introducing a new species, but that range is going to expand north. So you're helping those Carolinian species, and we know that they would probably thrive here. Like, that would be my recommendation, as opposed to a species that isn't typically in Ontario, or that isn't yet in Ontario.
Thank you so much. And we have another question. So do you go with watershed to define natives in terms of range? How do you define a native, I guess, is what the question is ultimately asking.
Oh, that's a good question. So I would rely on a reliable source to tell me what the range of that plant is. So a watershed is an interesting way of looking at something. So a watershed, just so everybody knows, is all of the area that drains into a particular stream or a particular body of water. That is a watershed. And when we are designing cities, we're designing towns, we're looking at that development from a watershed perspective. But from a species management perspective, there's a lot more different components that come into play, such as the climate, and that's not defined specifically by the watershed. So I would just look at the species range, and that's usually documented.
I'm going through the chat and I'm not seeing any further questions. A lot of good food for thought is a lot of thank yous for the informative presentation, a lot of good links to some of the content that has come up through the course of tonight's webinar. So I encourage any who are interested in getting more information on some of these topics to filter through. And again, Sylvia just provided another link in regards to native species by Ontario Eco District. So what a well-versed audience, and thank you so much to everyone that came here tonight. I think since we are no longer have questions, we are at a stage where we can wrap up for this evening. Again, thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you so much for Kimberly for taking the time to speak with us and share your insights and give us different perspectives, or just give us more information on a very, very, very important topic. So thank you all for joining us tonight. As I mentioned earlier on at the start of the webinar, this this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our social media channels in upcoming days and weeks. So keep an eye out for that. And any new communications will be posted on our website. So check back regularly to see what's new and happening with NIMS. And as always, if you're interested in becoming a volunteer or helping join the board, you can more than welcome to reach out to our website and see how you can become more engaged with NIMS. If you have any questions or comments, now's the time. Otherwise, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend and enjoy the very first day of spring. It was a pleasure. Oh, one more. We have two minutes left. We do have a raised hand from Deborah who just snuck in there. So Deborah, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask the last question for the evening. Let's try again.
Oh, Deborah, you're on mute.
There
There you go.
I think as she's unmuting, I'm muting her back.
There we
Thank you,
go.
Deborah.
I'm
Sorry
unmuted.
about that.
Okay. I have a question concerning your stance on attracting wildlife to the yards, because there is quite a push on right now for people to nativize their urban yards to create wildlife habitat. And the Canadian Wildlife Federation even gives ones out awards for people who do this. And yet, according to the climate change models, we shouldn't be doing that. So how do you reconcile those two positions?
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about actually, because even my own pollinator garden, that really wild space in my yard, what I do is I leave it wild and I don't clean it up in the fall. So all of those plants like the goldenrod, the New England aster, they hold on to their seeds all throughout the winter and they feed native birds. So, and also just having those native plants there, they actually also support many types of native pollinators, such as monarch butterflies, native bees, things like that. So I am supporting wildlife. But what's important is that the birds are, they're going to be contained to that one wild area of my garden. But I'm not going to sit close to there. So I'm not going to have like a picnic table that's right beside there so that if a bird flies over to get to those particular plants, that it's going to fly overhead of me and, you know, potentially defecate or whatever. So I think it's really about, again, risk management is about context. What does your property look like? Do you have a huge property? Do you have a tiny property? How close are you when you're gardening to the other elements of your property? Are you able to incorporate certain things? So I know a lot of farmers, for example, are being encouraged to use native plants, again, to support the biodiversity on their farms, to bring in that biodiversity and all of the benefits that that helps with. It can also help with planting certain native plants can help support things like wasps that are natural pesticides, essentially, right? So there's a lot of different uses for native plants, but I think it really comes down to context. So do you want a coyote or a raccoon on your property?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not. But do you want, or maybe you do, in which case then it comes down to context, right? So if you have a very large property and you're okay with coyotes and raccoons being on your property, maybe have whatever it is that's going to attract them at the very far end of your property, and then have your garden, which is where you're personally going to be, in a small fenced in area, so that the coyotes and the raccoons don't necessarily access that one garden area where you're growing food, but that they're okay to be at the very far end where there's, like, you know, native plants and a native space for them. So it's really about context and about trying to keep yourself safe. That's what I would say.
We're trying to find the balance.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kim. And
I see Catherine has her hand up.
Yeah, I think Catherine, do you still want to ask your question? You may unmute. And I think you will be the last question for the evening.
It's not even a question, it's just a comment. To me, it's a little bit sad to think that we prefer to sit under an umbrella than to sit under a tree, and experience that in my own backyard where I had a beautiful locust and it was just getting too big, too close to the house. But I would get these little red ants falling down and all kinds of things. So I was pretty miserable anyway. So I can appreciate the umbrella more now, but it just still strikes me as a little sad.
Yeah.
Sitting under an umbrella. That's all. But not really. I have maybe questions, but I'll think of them after the program is done, I'm sure.
So I concur with you, and actually, again, like, this speaks to risk management as a best practice. Essentially, it really comes down to context. So if you're really healthy and you're really not concerned about the potential pathogens that you might get, like if you feel that you're in great health, you might be okay to sit under a tree, but then someone else that does have health concerns might want to make sure that they're extremely diligent to avoid that kind of scenario. So that was also the perspective that I took in this webinar was, let's look at all of the risks and let's take the most risk averse perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm 74, my son had Lyme disease, so we're certainly interested in the umbrellas these days.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for everyone that came out tonight and those who asked questions or, shared insights and participated holistically in this presentation and webinar. It was great for the turnout, and we appreciate you and we appreciate the speaker. And we hope to host more of these, and we will keep you guys all informed of when we do, and we love your feedback. So if there's anything you wish to share, feel free to reach out. When we're having these webinars, we're often asking the question, what would you like to hear more of? Or learn more about? So be sure to put in your input when those polls do come out. So thanks again. Have a wonderful evening, and do stay safe.
Thanks for doing this.
You're very, very welcome. You have a wonderful evening and happy spring.